What's up, geeks? My name is Kev, and today we're giving you our spoiler-free thoughts on a movie that suggests the dating game might not be a fun one, at least if you're dating an 80s heavy metal drummer that moonlights as a winter soldier. If that sounds confusing as hell, it was deliberate, because again, today we're reviewing the movie fresh, and we're keeping this tasty morsel spoiler-free. Written by Lauren Kahn and directed by Mimi Cave in her directorial debut, Fresh shows the horrors of modern dating seen through one young woman's defiant battle to survive her boyfriend's unusual appetites. The film stars Daisy Edgar Jones, Sebastian Stan, and JoJo T. Gibbs. The movie is available to stream on Hulu and Disney Plus beginning on March 4th. As always, a huge thank you to Disney Plus Canada for giving us early access so we could chomp into this movie and give you our thoughts before you check it out. Joining me today are two podcast connoisseurs looking to serve you your just desserts. It's Nate and Justin.
Yummy.
How are we after watching that one, gentlemen? Did we work up an appetite?
I'm so hungry. I was so hungry. I immediately had to go grab a big, thick slice of steak.
I have to say, it didn't get to me, but I don't know if Sarah will be eating meat anytime soon. So
yeah, I was kind of turned off. I was turned off by it.
The next week has been thrown upside down now.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, why don't we jump right in and talk about maybe some things that we liked about the movie.
The visuals, I think, in this movie are a standout. I think they're speaking of like stomach turning and having moments of sort of really feeling uneasy because of what you're seeing without giving too much away, I thought was really, really well done. And I'll just quickly shout out the cinematographer, Paweł Pogorzelski. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but
Hereditary.
I thought it was, yeah.
He's done
and I
movies,
love his stuff, right? And I love how it sort of he finds they find ways to add this sort of light storytelling through cinematography that I thought was really cool. And the way they initially show the close-ups of our main characters and sort of how it romanticizes them, but then it uses those same close-ups to make us feel uneasy, and it gets more and more menacing. Really, really cool. I thought that was really well done.
He balances, the cinematography definitely balances between the romantic and the intimate moments with tense, extreme close-up wides too. Like, I love that. They sprinkle in some POV. I think that the eye of this story is very unique. It adopts some of the horror thriller traditions, but it also does feel, for lack of better words, very fresh in this storytelling, as it put you in the place of those moments, the tender moments and the more intimate moments. They're so extreme close-up and they're slowed down, and even just the montages of some of these sort of more grotesque moments that are intermingled and almost spliced together with very, very deliberate sound effects. Like, Mimi Cave did a great job with kind of really directing some of the visuals with the cinematographer of modern horror films. It's very fitting to see him bring that sort of aesthetic here.
I think they even play with sound really well. When she's, you can feel her uncomfortableness as she's on that first date, as the movie sort of opens up, and she's not paying attention to her date because the guy's just jabbering on about nonsense, and so it's almost like you're in the fish tank and it's all blurred out. Like, they do play with visuals and sounds to give a real perspective of what the character is seeing and hearing and feeling.
And it does that first, I would say the first 30 minutes, the pacing is great. I think it gets enough time to breathe while at the same time giving it a really decent build of tension, which I thought was really well done. And it does highlight the anxiety and fear of modern dating from Noah's perspective, like, really, really well.
Sure.
And to the point where I was like, I see what they're going for here. And it was,
exactly.
It was well done.
Well, let's talk about performances, because I think that was another thing that really stood out, and I think the chemistry between Daisy Edgar Jones and Sebastian Stan was amazing. It felt very real. It felt very effortless. And Sebastian Stan, the level of showmanship with that slight bit of camp, it was next level. As the villain of this horror thriller parody, whatever we want to call it, he does take center stage as his character's sort of mental state, his desires are just sort of put on display, and very much the hook of this movie, like learning about his intentions. And I loved how Daisy's character really, she was sort of the victim, but then really kind of feeds into that sort of being submissive, very typical I feel like, this film does play with some of those typical tropes of, sexism and objectification. And, at this point, her character is kind of being submissive in a way to almost become the ultimate creep. So I think it's interesting to see how there is that sort of juxtaposition in the movie.
Yeah, I think there's movies, and I'll get to this maybe a little bit later. I think there's movies that have done everything you just described better, but as far as Daisy Edgar Jones's performance, it got better as this movie kind of got worse. Like, I got at the beginning, it was a lot of awkward sort of Twilight era Kristen Stewart vibes of like the weird smiles and things like that. But over the course of the movie, she really steps up her performance, and I thought she was really, really great. Yeah, I loved her.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's such a chameleon aspect to Sebastian Stan's performance in this, and the more we see him now, he's so much more than the stark, reserved character that we see when he portrays Winter Soldier. And here we get a whole arsenal of emotions and ranges that he gets to sort of play with, and you can tell he's really having a good time doing so.
Yeah,
and I did find that he's goofy, he's zany. You know what I mean? Like he's kind of given.
He's
that
Animaniac.
Yeah,
he's zany too.
He's doing the dancing, but I just mean like he shows a side of him that I personally haven't seen in a lot of his roles, and I really dug him all the way up until probably the last 15 minutes of this movie, where it's not necessarily like his performance that's the problem. It's more the writing that he has to work with that really starts to just
falls apart,
to become and really one note. And just kind of what you'd expect.
It sounds like we're almost ready to move into some things that we didn't like. Before we do, I do want to quickly shout out some of the music choices that were incorporated into the soundtrack. Playing "Piece of Me" by Lady Ray and "Heads Will Roll" by the Ya Ya Ya's at just perfect times.
Yeah,
I thought that it can sometimes be overdone in a movie, but here I thought it was done just the right amount of times and at the perfect times that it really enhanced the moments that they were incorporated into.
It reminded me of the film from last year that we were talking about, Promising Young Woman. Very intentional in terms of the reference of where these soundtrack moments showed up. The score itself was interesting. It had that very violin-esque, very tense, strings being pulled very long. But to your point, the sort of more modern songs that were referenced, they felt very intentional and at the moments that they did pop up.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up Promising Young Woman, because that helps me sort of shift into things that I didn't like, because I felt that while the movie as a whole was fine, it just felt like there were elements from a whole bunch of different movies I'd already seen. Promising Young Woman, Get Out, and they were just sort of mashed together here. And so this did nothing to sort of be unique or stand out or introduce anything new.
Yeah, it's like Nate said, it started strong. What felt very playful in the first 30 minutes as it built that tension and it had fun with it, it just kind of adhered to it in the end, right? It just became very typical and very confined.
It sort of shoots its shot way too soon, in the sense that we get to the 30-minute mark and it gets really intriguing, and then it slows down to a crawl, and I was okay with it because I was really intrigued. But then it starts to become bland, unoriginal in its third act, and you can see the writing relying on some really common tropes within this genre. And it recently these days we get a lot of movies like you just described that play with those tropes and sort of they use them in a smart way or make a commentary of them, right? Yeah. But this movie just uses them and it relies on them, and it relies on them as a means to the end to serve the story, and it just starts to get to a place where you're kind of like, wow, I was so stoked for this. It had such a good beginning, and then it just drops off and becomes another one of these movies. And again, like you said, there's movies that utilize these ingredients better. There's one that I can think of that I won't say for spoilers' sake, but yeah, Get Out and Gone Girl, I think, were the two that came to my mind the most watching this movie.
I think the problem was they worked these characters into a very tight corner and didn't have any way to get out without relying on the characters suddenly making irrational and stupid decisions that they clearly would not have to be in the position that they were in as this movie started, particularly with Sebastian Stan's character. It was just, he makes a really dumb decision towards the end of the movie you could see it coming, and then it just happens, and it's like, it was just so frustrating that's what they ended up sort of doing to resolve everything.
And without spoilers, for his character to be for his character to be believable in what he's doing and what he's necessarily getting away with, the fact that he does make that decision is what is most infuriating, because you're like, no, but now all of a sudden I don't believe any of this setup. I don't believe that this guy could have pulled this off. So it's just,
right.
Yeah, it was super upsetting.
Yeah, I think the main thing for me, at least, was, again, I do think the runtime was a little bit too long, because, again, it started to feel very typical. It started to feel very predictable as well, especially as we got to the end there. It just felt like a mad dash to just kind of wrap it up.
I don't necessarily know if you need to lop off 15 minutes from the movie, but it could have been spent better building up and justifying the conclusion of the movie. It could have been, rather than just sort of repeating the middle act over and over, and it doesn't build to the conclusion like I think the movie thinks it's doing, at least not in a very satisfying way.
That's a good point.
But I mean, I think there were pros and cons to the movie, so why don't we get to our final thoughts, and then we will serve up some scores for this movie, which we'll be doing on a scale of 1 to 5 fleshy meatballs.
Cool. I love that. Yeah. I think overall I enjoyed this movie for its performances and aesthetical direction. The film does play up the typical horror tropes with some modern flares, but this film feels more like a dark comedy that parodies the horror thriller genre. That being said, I don't know if that's necessarily how it wrapped up. It kind of fell into that box very quickly, but the film is elevated by great performances from Daisy Edgar-Jones, who plays that awkward loner, as you said, Kevin, navigating the horrors of online dating, and Sebastian Stan, both charming and dark all at once. The cinematography was next level, and it does give it a real good point of view and really creates an eye. And with Mimi Cave's directorial debut, she really did have intention of where she put that camera, and it very much spoke every time you watched a scene play out. In the end, this film adheres to its typical cliches that feel overplayed as it reaches its final act, even to the degree of the overt implications of the sexism and the objectification of women, which we know is very much seen as a rhetoric within horror thriller genres. That too felt very overplayed and ends up confining the film into a box. I think the film started great. Gotta love the 30 minutes in before you get a title card, and in the end it felt very typical, much like the horror movies that we've come to know. That being said, I appreciate that Mimi Cave's directorial debut had an aesthetical choice, had a motive. However, it's not necessarily the directorial debut of something like Get Out, which was, obviously Jordan Peele's first film, and it really was impactful. But it does seem like she did get some things right, and she's still figuring out the balancing of story. It just feels like at the end, these genre tropes that she was playing with, she just became victim to and just fell into that box. So I'm going to give this one 3 out of 5 fleshy meatballs.
Alrighty. The movie, as we've kind of just been talking about in this last half here, it starts off really strong, really intriguing. It kind of, I think it almost feels like they created a movie that had some really, really strong ideas right off the top, but didn't have enough to see it through. And maybe that is why its runtime I thought it was only an hour and a half long. Is it longer than that? It's only an hour and a half, right?
It plays at about an hour and 54 minutes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So but it still felt too long, right? And I think they could have found ways to maybe scale that back a bit, and maybe even focus a little bit more on some of the intriguing newer stuff that we were getting at the beginning of the movie, because I do think that cinematography was really noticeable, and then you get distracted by all the common modern tropes of this genre as the movie goes on, and I think there's probably more good in the movie than we're actually calling out, but only because we don't see it as to how much the story gets sloppy and falls off, much like
I think that's
this
spot on.
Review. Yeah. But as its antagonist starts to show his true colors, that's where we really start to get more one note. As much as I loved Sebastian Stan's performance all the way up until the end, and I think at the same time, Daisy Edgar Jones also did a really good job. I think for a first debut movie, this was a really good
movie
shot, a good shot for your first debut. That's awesome, and especially to get actors like this and these performances, and again, the look of the film was really well done. So, but I wasn't overall totally satisfied. So I'm going to do a 3 out of 5. Fleshy meatballs. I will not be going in for seconds.
Oh, that's well done. Yeah, I think we're all kind of on the same page here. I think, as we've mentioned, I think the performances were great. The actors did the best that they could do with what they were giving. I think for a directorial debut, Mimi Cave did a terrific job of sort of introducing the kind of vision that she'll have behind the lens, given the script that she had to work with. I think it really does boil down to a failure in writing, at least in crafting that third act and not just falling into really cliched tropes. I don't know if this movie knew exactly what it wanted to be. If it was supposed to be horror, it wasn't scary enough. If it was supposed to be a dark comedy, it wasn't funny enough. And if it was supposed to be a commentary on these different genres, it didn't really have anything to say. And so I think that's what held everything back. I think, the music, the score, the cinematography, all those things we talked about, they all created a great environment that just had nothing to say, unfortunately. And so I'm right there with you. I'm giving this a 3.1 out of 5 fleshy meatballs. Wow,
you love this
Wow,
movie.
That's a huge... Yeah. You loved it. Across that 3 line, bro.
2% better than you guys. Look at it. Well, I do think it's time to get this podcast on ice, box it up, and ship it out to our voracious listeners. This was our spoiler-free review for Fresh. Thanks for tuning in wherever you listen to podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and leave us a glowing review, or we might just have to give you a kick in the booty, if you've still got one. As always, reach out and say hi, and let us know if you'll be checking out the odd delicacy that is Fresh. You can do so at wearegeekcentric@gmail.com, or if that reminds you a bit too much of fava beans and a nice Chianti, hit us up on Twitter at GeekcentricYT and Instagram at wearegeekcentric. Keep in mind, we also have a ton of other episodes covering a variety of other content, with new content always coming out. Recently, to celebrate Pokemon Day, Nate was joined by Canadian actor Monroe Chambers and Pokemon content creator Mr. Mitch George to discuss the latest announcements from the Pokemon Company. Plus, our spoiler-free review of Uncharted is available. And coming soon, our spoiler-filled review of The Batman. And of course, every week, we come at you with This Week in Geek, where we share the latest in news, trailers, and all things geek-centric. But until next time, Jayla, Nate, thanks for joining me. And as we say,
love ya.
Get home safe, guys.
Peace.